I'm Greg Roskopf, and I'm the owner and developer of Muscle Activation Technique. So thank you for being here. I know kind of tough times right now with everything going on with coronavirus and I think just what's going on with the economy and work. And I know with this group of practitioners, we're all licensed practitioners or non-licensed practitioners, which makes it tough. We're non-essential practitioners, which puts an impact on the ability to be able to work right now and see clients. So and I'm in that boat, and I feel for everybody going through that right now. It's tough times, and I think we all look forward to getting back to what's normal. And normal is, working with clients. I think we all enjoy what we do on a day-to-day basis. So basically what I want to bring to you today is kind of a little introduction to muscle activation techniques. And if you're familiar with it, basically muscle activation techniques deals with the muscle system's role in chronic pain and injury. And we recognize that whenever you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. And many of you that are here in this group, you're coming from the training industry. And in the training industry, we're dealing with muscle function. We're dealing with forces on the body. And the question is, how does the body tolerate these forces? I think that's the key. We think in the big picture, exercise is a good thing. In the medical world, exercise is the cure-all for every disease out there. From coronary heart disease, diabetes, any type of ailment, inflammatory-based ailment, exercise is designed to be the cure-all, literally, for every disease out there. A non-medicine, medical approach to health is exercise. But the problem is when exercise becomes a stress. Exercise can become part of the problem. If exercise is a stress, then it can have negative impacts on the body. And you think on the other side of it, where exercise is a cure-all for every disease out there, inflammation is the common denominator behind every disease out there. Coronary heart disease, diabetes, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, all of these diseases have an inflammatory basis behind it. So if exercise is compounding that inflammatory response, then it can be a stress, and it can actually be part of the problem. And that's not what we signed up for when we get into the exercise world. And so we have to be more conscious with our clients when we're thinking from an exercise perspective is we don't want to be part of the problem. And then probably the biggest question is, how do we know? How do we know when we put a force on somebody's body, when we set them up on an exercise program, how do we know whether or not we have a positive effect or a negative effect? And that's where MAT comes in. MAT basically, provides an environment where you have checks and balances. We have checks and balances to be able to say, did that, what I just did, whether it's a stretch or everything from, you see in the gyms, the Theraguns, the vibrating guns that are supposed to release tissues, and foam rolling, and any form of exercise, resistance exercise with weights. And how do we know when we put that force on somebody's body whether or not it has a positive effect or a negative effect? And the nice part is we're going to give you the tools and some information to kind of show how we can check. Because I always say with MAT, the best goal of MAT is we want to fix what we break. If we actually do cause inhibition and it exceeds somebody's tolerance level, it can have negative effects on muscle function. And if we have these negative effects, with muscle activation techniques, we actually provide the tools to be able to fix what you break. And basically get muscles reactivated, reestablish the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system, and in the big picture, actually reduce inflammation and provide an environment where the body can heal. And so as I talk about that, we'll get in more depth on the principles behind MAT. But if I talk about it, I'll give a little history on myself. When I was 19 years old, I had a fractured vertebrae. And with that fractured vertebrae, I had to sacrifice my last year of eligibility playing football in college. Fortunately, as I graduated from college, I got a job as a strength and conditioning coach at Fresno State. And being a strength and conditioning coach, I mean, that's what we're talking about, muscle function. I mean, I'm working at, I mean, Division I sports, setting people up on exercise programs. And the nice thing about it is that's all I did. I mean, that's all I enjoyed as I was playing football in college and going through my education career. I loved working out. And so the strength coaching position was the best possible job I could get. And so I worked as a strength and conditioning coach, but I had this history of my fractured vertebrae. And so that kind of was always in the background of my progression as I was trying to move forward in the field. I was still dealing with my own physical issues. And so literally over time, I mean, a fracture should heal in 8 weeks. And so I'm a few years, I mean, after graduating from college, 22, 23 years old, I'm still having problems. And now I just don't have back problems. I have other residual problems. I had patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, SI joint dysfunction. I literally had one injury after another. And I was literally like at 25 years old, I'm sitting in my profession thinking, if I'm this bad at 25, what am I going to be like when I'm 50? And because literally as we age, that's when we start to break down. And I was 25 years old, I would say, feeling some of the aging issues that people deal with later on in life. And so as I'm working as a strength and conditioning coach, I'm also working with the athletes, and I always say you can do anything wrong with athletes and still have success with athletes, because the integrity of their neuromuscular system is so high that their body will adapt. But there's certain people, there were certain athletes that I worked with that were kind of like me. They were like, always injury prone. They had one injury after another, and it seems like they were in the training room all the time, and the trainers and strength coaches were all rolling their eyes back at them, and because it's like, well, man, they're always injured. They're a hypochondriac, or something's wrong with them. They're not mentally strong. Well, the problem was I was one of those people, and so I could relate. So I started putting my focus on the people that weren't. It wasn't the people that were benefiting from the exercise. Just like, what's going on with these people that aren't adapting the way they should? Most athletes are getting bigger, faster, stronger, and these ones are breaking down. And so I could relate, because I was breaking down as I progressed, and I had to sacrifice my last year of eligibility for football because of it. And so I focused on those people and started trying to correlate what was going on. And the main key is it seemed that one injury led to compensatory issues that would put increased stress on other joints and tissue. And it just seemed to be a continual unfolding of injuries. Like the body had to compensate and adapt. And it's almost like driving your car with bad alignment. You drive your car with bad alignment, the harder and faster you drive it, the faster it's going to break down. And so once you have an injury, what I figured out later on is, the stress, trauma, or overuse, the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. And it's like, so when you have an injury, it actually starts this downward spiral. Your body has to compensate for that injury. And so it goes into a protective state and start kind of protecting the joints and tissues that got injured. And it's, and literally through muscle tightness, it doesn't allow a lot of motion through those areas. And so now your body has to pick up that motion somewhere else. And then the next thing you know, you have increased stress on other joints and tissue. So what started out as an ankle sprain, next thing you know, now you have knee pain, and later on you have, back pain. And it just is this downward progression that people go on when they start out, when they have an injury that doesn't fully resolve or doesn't fully heal. And so I started, seeing this with my own self. I'm a strength coach. I'm working out hard. I was beating myself up, and so I needed to figure out a way to help myself, let alone help these people that I was hired to work with as a strength and conditioning coach. So I started seeking out specialists in all fields, from chiropractic, physical therapy, podiatry, and every field. But the main thing that I was looking at was that I wanted people that understood the biomechanics of movement, the interrelationships of joints. And because as I progressed from being a strength coach, I had the opportunity to work with some great physical therapists. One I worked with directly, who was a physical therapist that taught courses across the country to physical therapists relating to pelvic girdle malalignments and SI joint dysfunction and spinal mobilization techniques. And he looked at the body as a whole. And ironically, one time I was working with him and him as a biomechanics specialist. My back was bothering me, and one day he said, "Here, let me take a look at you." And it was amazing. He mobilized my big toe, and said my MTP joint was restricted. He mobilized my big toe, and my back pain was gone for a day. And I was like, literally, how does my big toe joint have anything to do with my back pain? But that was the first thing that opened my eyes that this is an integrated system. And if you have abnormal motion in one joint, you're going to have to pick up that motion somewhere else. And if your body's not prepared to tolerate those forces somewhere else, then you can start having problems in other joints and tissues. And so that was my first opening understanding of the interrelationships of joints, that the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the trunk, all the way to the occiput are all interrelated. And so I sought out specialists that were in all fields that were looking at the body from a biomechanical standpoint. And so then I got tied in with this guy, a physical therapist named Gary Gray. Gary Gray was the king of functional movement. 30 years, Gary Gray still teaches in the health and exercise and rehab industries. But at that point, he only taught his principles to physical therapists. And he was he was a physical therapist specializing in functional movement. And basically now we could look at it as these myofascial chains, and it's the same concepts just put into this myofascial system. But these were things Gary Gray was talking about 20 or 30 years ago. And so I had the opportunity to learn from him. I had the opportunity from these therapists, and I'm working in these sports medicine clinics, and I'm their exercise guy. I'm their biomechanics specialist that worked with injured athletes to just the general public. But I was the exercise guy in this biomechanically based physical therapy group. It was Bud Ferrante and Richard Jackson that I worked with early on. And it was neat to tie in biomechanics and have an understanding. And it was funny because as an exercise, coming from an exercise physiology standpoint, I'm like, man, I don't have a clue. These guys understand mechanics, and I didn't have a clue about it at all, especially from an injury standpoint. They were dealing with injuries and the biomechanics related to injury. So as I was learning from specialists, I continued to seek out people that were, kind of had their background, this interrelationship, biomechanical based thought process. And the interesting thing is, as I sought out specialists that focused on biomechanics, from chiropractic, physical therapy, podiatry, massage, exercise, the common denominator from every practice that I learned, or every modality, was that tightness is the cause of the problem. So if looking at me personally, my back pain, along with my SI joint, my knee pain, my plantar fasciitis, the reason that I was having all these problems was because I was so tight. And I was. After I had the fractured vertebrae, my whole body went into a protective state, and I was tight. And I could barely bend down to touch my knees, let alone my toes. And so it was great to hear from all these specialists and gain an understanding of biomechanics. And the same way, like Richard Jackson mobilized my big toe joint because it was restricted. So whether it was mobilization techniques, chiropractic adjustments, deep tissue massage, stretching technique, the common denominator with every field and every modality that I was learning from the specialists in, was that you have to address the tightness. Tightness is the cause of dysfunction. But the problem was with me personally, is every time I would stretch or get deep tissue massage, I couldn't get out of bed the next day. I'd have numbness and sciatica down into my big toe. And so I was like literally, I understand the interrelationships of joints. I understand biomechanics and movement. I was applying these principles to my clients, to the athletes and the injured people that I was working with in the physical therapy world, and especially with athletes, it was working. And people would have success with these principles. And to the point that I'm applying these principles as the biomechanics specialist. I got hired by the Utah Jazz through the Stockton Malone era. had the opportunity to work with John Stockton at a wedding, and next thing you know, he got me in the door and got me hired with the Utah Jazz, and I worked with them for the last 10 years through the Stockton Malone era. And I was this functional range of motion guy. Gary Gray taught me the principles of functional movement, functional training, and I was applying these principles and have people going through planes of motion trying to strengthen their body to eccentrically control motion in one direction, then concentrically move in the other. And I was I was trying to improve function. And so I had a lot of success with these principles, and then from an isolated standpoint, wherever there are limitations in range of motion, I knew those limitations in range of motion had to be addressed. So I had all these techniques that I learned through physical therapists, massage therapists, all these different modalities, deep tissue work and release techniques. I had all of these techniques all designed to help release tissues. And so I got hired by the Utah Jazz, and I'm this functional range of motion guy. So that got me to the pro level. It got me hired by the Denver Broncos also. And so these principles work, and especially with athletes. But there's still this group of people, like when I was at Fresno State, there's still a group of people that didn't get better with it. And then as I got out more into the real world and dealing with people that weren't as athletic and the integrity of their neuromuscular system was not as high, all of a sudden the success rates weren't as high. And I didn't understand why. It had to make me look deeper at what I was doing, but it also made me look back at what I was doing with myself, knowing that it's not working for me. Even though it's working in the practical world and I'm hired at the pro sport level, it's not working for me. And so that kind of led me to the idea, like, what's wrong with me, and why am I not getting healthy? I mean, people are coming to you to get healthy. I mean, exercise, the whole reason people work with trainers is try and get healthy. And what's the biggest frustration from the training standpoint, the exercise standpoint? When a client comes in and says, you know what, I can't do that exercise, my knee hurts. Or I can't do that exercise, and you know what, I can't even come in today, I was skiing this weekend and I tweaked my back. So the greatest frustration that you have is when a client comes in and is complaining of pain. And you think about it, what are the conventional methods of dealing with pain? The first thing is you avoid the exercises that create pain. Like, I'm not showing up today because I'm in pain. Or you do an exercise and say a leg press and the knee hurts, and it's like, you know what, let's not do that exercise today because it's creating pain. Or you change the position of the feet and turn the foot in, and, oh, does that hurt? Yeah, that still hurts. You turn the foot out, oh, that doesn't hurt. So then you end up kind of working around the pain. And so you try and work through the pain because you still want to get your exercise. But the other thing is many people end up quitting working out. They just get to the point where it hurts too much to work out. The frustration as trainers, going back to that idea, is that people have pain and they can't do the things. And then what do you do as trainers? It's like if somebody's sent to you and they have a herniated disc, what do you do as a trainer? Like, okay, I need to, my doctor says I want to avoid surgery. So he told me to start an exercise program. As a trainer, what do? You run. Like, I don't want to touch that person. And you start playing around. Does this hurt? Does that hurt? You start trying to play around and just have them do things that don't hurt. But with really no real rhyme or reason. And so what we're going to talk about today is with the history I just talked about and the development of MAT, we're going to take a different look at pain, because muscles have a huge impact on people's pain levels. The function of the muscles, the neuromuscular system, has a huge impact on people's function or pain levels. So the first question, when I'm having all of these issues, I've sought out specialists in all fields, and all the mobilization, range of motion techniques that I was using weren't helping me. And actually, when I would stretch or deep tissue massage, I actually felt worse. Then I took a step back and said, why do muscles tighten up? I mean, why am I so tight? I wasn't tight before I had the fractured vertebrae. Why am I so tight right now? Well, the natural neurological response is when the body senses instability, it tightens up as a protective mechanism. So I just thought about it. It's like, well, when we walk on ice, what's the first thing we do when we walk on ice? We tighten up as a protective mechanism. So that's a neurological response. The minute we step off the ice, we no longer tighten up. So it's part of the protective mechanism, protecting you. Imagine if somebody gave you some muscle relaxers and took away all your protective mechanisms and you were walking on ice and you didn't shorten your stride length and go into protective mode, you'd slip and fall and injure yourself. So maybe this tightness is a symptom having to do with some instability issue. And again, before I was talking about, I said stress, trauma, and overuse, and the resultant inflammation can alter the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. And when that communication pathways get altered, it's like having loose battery cables. The muscles just don't fire the way they're designed to fire. It's like they're kind of sluggish, like you're sitting in the car trying to start your car with loose battery cables. It just won't start. Well, the brain's sending messages and it's just not getting to the muscles the way it's designed to get to the muscle. So the muscles can't do their job to protect you, protect joints and protect you from injury. Now you have the idea that muscles move bones and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. When muscles can't contract effectively due to stress, trauma, or overuse, when they can't contract effectively, they can't do their job to hold bones in proper alignment and provide stability through movement. So what I realized is the same way when we walk on ice that you have this instability issue and your body goes into a protective state, that when you have muscle weakness or inhibition due to inflammation, you have the same type of instability issue. The body goes into this protective state and says, I'm unstable. I need to tighten up and protect. And so after my fractured vertebrae, I was chronically tight. But the focus of every modality out there had been to focus on the tightness. And this was the point when I started realizing that tightness may just be a symptom. And what brought me to this conclusion, I told you I got hired by the Utah Jazz. And I started working on John Stockton. I met him at a wedding. We did an evaluation of range of motion and functional movement and was able to show how he had, through his career, he had patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, and Achilles tendonitis, and no one had ever correlated that those injuries may all be related. And I was able to show him how they were all interrelated, able to improve his functional movement as a range of motion functional guy. So I got hired with these principles being the range of motion functional guy. And worked with him, and when I worked with him, I got tied in with the chiropractor for the Utah Jazz, Craig Bueller. Dr. Craig Bueller, a great guy, performed clinical kinesiology. And with clinical kinesiology, they do manual muscle testing. I'd been exposed to manual muscle testing through athletic training classes I took when getting my degree and master's, but never found a place for it. But when I was working with him and we were looking at muscle testing, he would do his work with clinical kinesiology, and I'd do my range of motion and functional work. And where I'd work on John, where I saw tightness, I'd work on having release techniques and PNF stretching to try and increase his range of motion. And so Bueller would do his muscle testing. And one day Bueller had tested John, everything was strong in his hip, but he was limited in hip internal rotation. So at 90 degrees of hip flexion, 90 degrees of hip flexion and knee flexion, he was very tight in hip internal rotation. So I did my techniques to increase his range of motion. By the time we're done, he's got great range of motion in hip internal rotation. And Bueller came back and started doing some manual muscle testing through his clinical kinesiology work. And all of a sudden, weaknesses showed up that weren't there before I did my work. And he turned to me and looked at me and said, "What did you do?" And I don't know, but it can't be a good thing. The fact that he was strong before I did this, did my techniques, and now he's weak. Something didn't sit right. Something didn't sit right with me. Like, why was he weak now? And so I started working with him regularly. I'd fly back and forth to Utah from Fresno, where I was living, and I started learning the muscle test. He got me all the manuals with clinical kinesiology, and I started playing around with the muscle testing. And most manual muscle testing through clinical and applied kinesiology, they test muscles in mid-range. They don't test in the extremes of range of motion. Well, when I started noticing wherever I saw a limitation in range of motion, let's take the example of a limitation in range of motion in hip internal rotation, I would test the muscle out of the extreme of range of motion, and I started correlating that whenever I would see a limitation in range of motion, there was coinciding weakness. And so tightness and weakness seem to go hand in hand. And so all of a sudden, this whole paradigm shift of thought process, I've been a range of motion guy my whole life, and now I'm starting to correlate that wherever there was a limitation in range of motion, there was correlating muscle weaknesses. Well, the other thing I started noticing is when I was doing my range of motion focused techniques to increase range of motion, there were times that muscles didn't show up weak, but then when I would have greater range of motion, I would test them in their newfound range of motion, and all of a sudden they'd have weaknesses that weren't showing up before. Because I just increased mobility that wasn't stable. I just opened up a range that was unstable. And so I realized this tightness was part of the body's protective mechanism. What a great protective mechanism by the body is, I'm not going to allow you to go into positions where you're weak. So I'm going to tighten up and protect you so you don't go into those positions. Because if you're weak, you're unstable. And if you're unstable, you're vulnerable. Anytime you have mobility without stability, you have vulnerability for injury. So the body's not going to allow you to maintain ranges of motion if you're not stable through those ranges. So you think of that with clients that you work with, that you stretch, they stretch day after day after day, and they never seem to have any long-term changes in flexibility, because the minute they stand up and put forces on their body and the body senses that instability, it's like walking on ice. They go right back into their protective state. So I realized, shoot, for 10 years after having my fractured vertebrae, I was still unstable. And that's why I was so tight. And so literally that became the change, that put my focus on the fact that maybe this tightness is related to the weakness, and if I address the weakness, then we'll have more long-term changes in flexibility. And that was the thing that I saw. I mean, it wasn't, we talk about weakness, but it wasn't that I was weak. I mean, you look here, I was in college playing football. I was benching 400 pounds, squatting 500 pounds, so nobody could have told me I was weak. I work with pro athletes. I've been with the Denver Broncos for 23 years, and there's nobody that's going to say, oh, these athletes are weak. I mean, but they have weaknesses. They have neuromuscular inhibition. They have altered communication pathways that make the muscles not as efficient as they should be. But it's not about strength. It's about stability. It's about the ability for muscles to contract and contract on demand in order to stabilize joints through movement. So I realized, even though I was able to squat 500 pounds, bench press 400 pounds, I was working out. I would wear knee wraps, I would wear weight belts, I had elbow wraps, I had orthotics. I had all these artificial forms of stability, some external devices that were trying to provide stability that my neuromuscular system was not able to provide. And that's why I was in pain. Is that you're never going to be as strong when muscles can't fire on demand. But it wasn't that I was weak, I was unstable. I had no stability through motion, so my body was in this protective, tightening state. And the interesting thing is, the first time, with the idea that it's not about tightness, it's about weakness, the first time I had stretched my hamstrings and gotten massage and everything to try and loosen up my tight muscles because I could barely bend to touch my knees. The first time that I got my hip flexors and abdominal muscles activated, I bent down and touched my toes for the first time in 10 years. And I never lost that flexibility. And that's when I realized I'm onto something completely different than what I focused. I understood the interrelationships of joint. I understood how if you had instability or restricted motion in one joint, it could put negative stress on other joints and tissue. But all of a sudden, I had a paradigm shift in thought process that the tightness is part of the symptom. The weakness is the cause. And from that point forward, I started addressing the weakness and completely changed everything that I've done in my career. And it's been able to, literally, now I'm 56, doing things I couldn't do when I was 25. And so now I literally, with the clients that I've worked with over the years, 100% correlation. When they're coming tight, I know they're weak. If we can address the weakness issue, the neuromuscular weakness issue, we'll see long-term changes in flexibility. So moving forward, what is MAT? This process that was developed off of those thought processes. It's a biomechanically based process designed to identify and correct muscle imbalances that contribute to chronic pain or injury, and also may inhibit performances. So we basically look at muscle function with the role that if we can improve neuromuscular function, we can improve total body function. And so again, stress, trauma, overuse, and the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system to the point where the muscles just can't contract and contract on demand. Again, it's like having loose battery cables. When a muscle can't contract effectively, it can't shorten effectively. When the muscle can't shorten effectively, the opposite muscles won't lengthen effectively. So the opposite muscles show up as being tight. It's like a fight for dominance. If these are weaker, these don't have to be stronger. They just, if they're pulling it with normal tension, they're going to win. They're going to win the battle. And so as you have inhibition on one side, the other side becomes dominant, and those muscles end up showing up as being tight. And so tightness is a sign of weakness. The goal of muscle activation techniques is to identify where these altered communication pathways are and tighten battery cables. Improve the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system so those muscles can fire on demand. So the goal, again, tighten battery cables. This is just an example of just loose battery cables. Isolation versus integration. The integrated system, when we think of functional movement is basically an accumulation of movements of all of its isolated parts. The integrated system is only as good as the function of its isolated part. This woman basically, and I'll just explain, she came in unstable, she couldn't stand up. Literally, she would use every ounce of energy trying to stand up to help herself, push herself up. I don't have the video recordings tied into this file, so I apologize about that. But literally, after we got the muscles activated on the right side, we had her stand up and she just popped right up, like she didn't have to strain and use the table to help herself up. And the whole idea behind that was all we had to do was tighten battery cables, improve the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system, and the muscles get stronger on the spot. It's probably the only modality that I ever have seen that actually makes people stronger on the spot. And so on that, I wish I could show you the video. But literally, I mean, when you tighten battery cables, it's kind of like when you start, you're trying to start your car and it won't start, but then you jump start the battery and boom, it just starts right up. Muscles do the same thing, and you can increase force production of the muscles immediately when you activate muscle, i.e. tighten battery cable. And so as I move forward in this, I mean, is recognizing the integrated system is only as good as the function of its isolated parts. With MAT, we take an in-depth look from anatomy and kinesiology and say, how does this body move? How do we function? We're setting people on exercises and we're putting forces on people's bodies. How do we understand how the body moves, and can the body actually tolerate those forces? And if we recognize that every muscle or division of muscle in the body has its own set of battery cables, and we're only as strong as our weakest link. If we have certain muscles that have tight battery cables and good communication between the nervous system and the muscle system, they'll be able to fire every time you perform a movement. They'll be able to fire on demand. And the body will get from point A to point B most efficiently with what it has to work with. The problem is the ones that are sluggish, that aren't getting the input, are just along for the ride. They're not able to help us in our movement pattern. By the time they get involved, we've already gone. And you'll see it when you set somebody up on an exercise program. I mean, the body will get from point A to point B most efficiently with what it has to work with. So you can have somebody with a sternal division of their pec major weakness for whatever reason in the sternal division of their pec major. So you have them bench press, and all of a sudden they're shifting their body and dropping and trying to change their alignment so that they can find a position of strength. Say the clavicular fibers, they can actually pull in the clavicular fibers to lift that, but if you keep them at the horizontal adducted position, because they can't recruit those muscles on demand, the body will find alternative ways to perform the task. It's called compensation. The body will get from point A to point B most efficiently with what it has to work with. With MAT, we want to give it more to work with, because literally you can give somebody a cue and say, don't let your elbow drop, don't shift your body. I mean, they'll do something else. They'll shrug their shoulder. They'll do something else to find another form of compensation because the timing is off. And this timing and firing occurs beyond our conscious control. And since it occurs beyond our conscious control, the minute we bring in conscious thought to say, don't let my elbow move, we've already lost. We're just creating another form of compensation. And so our goal is to say, let's get these sternal fibers working, because the minute that they get activated, all of a sudden the body says, I don't have to compensate more because these muscles are firing on demand, and then you can appropriately strengthen the muscles. So when we're setting up people on exercise programs, how do we know whether or not the muscles that we're actually trying to strengthen are actually being the ones that are being focused on, that they're actually doing the job. They have all different divisions of muscles, and as I show the next slide, just rotator cuff muscles, the infraspinatus. There's actually 4 different divisions of the infraspinatus and the teres minor that are all external rotators of the humerus. And so each division has a different line of pull, and depending on its line of pull will dictate where it's dominant. So if I'm actually externally rotating my arm with my arm in an adducted position, the teres minor is actually the muscle, the prime mover. All of the other rotators are synergistic muscles. As I move into 30-degree ranges of abduction, kind of the fibers move up. So my lower division of the infraspinatus, my middle division, lower middle, upper middle, and upper division of the infraspinatus are all dictated of their line of pull is shifted and focused on depending on the position and the amount of abduction. So if I have a weakness in somebody in their superior and superior middle fibers of the infraspinatus, and they have rotator cuff issue or rotator cuff pain, but we're having to do these exercises to try and strengthen the rotator cuff, we may be reinforcing the muscles that are already strong. The problem is here, not here. And the question is, how do we know? When we set somebody up on a corrective exercise, how do we know if we're correcting anything? All we may be doing with the corrective exercise is reinforcing the dysfunction. So you have to ask, is like, how do we know? Like, if I want to know if they need to be doing an exercise here or they need to be doing an exercise here, because first we want to jumpstart the muscle, reestablish the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system so those muscles can fire. Then you follow it up with reinforcement exercise. One of the things I've always said, there's no such thing as corrective exercise, because if altered communication pathways exist, the strong will get stronger and the weak stay weak, and you magnify the imbalances. So in reality, is there true corrective exercises, or is there actually reinforcing dysfunction? So how functional is exercise if it's reinforcing dysfunction is a key that I've always asked. But recognize that every muscle, and you look at the division of muscles, they have their own set of battery cables and their own communication pathways with the central nervous system. In the ideal world, all of these battery cables are tight, and no matter where we move in space, the muscle that moves you there in that position is firing and firing on demand, which means then it can move you in those positions and there's no need for protective tightening and restricted range of motion. So muscle weaknesses from a neurological standpoint force the body to have to compensate and find positions of strength. The body will always try and find positions of strength. So as we move forward, basically the whole idea here, I'm just going to quickly say, if you look at that middle picture with the interfusal fiber, and the top one and the bottom one, you have an extrafusal fiber on the left and an interfusal on the right. The interfusal fiber on the right should always be under tension. As long as that's under tension, it's constantly providing feedback to the central nervous system. In the middle picture, that interfusal fiber is under slack. And if you look at the electrical activity on the far right, it shows there's a little flat spot. That means there's no input coming from the central nervous system. Whenever you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the sensitivity of the muscle spindle, or the interfusal fiber make up the muscle spindle, the sensitivity of the muscle spindle declines to the point where it no longer has tension on the muscle as the muscle shortens, which means the further that muscle shortens into its shortened range, the less input coming from the nervous system. So when muscles contract, and then we move into reciprocal inhibition, when a muscle contracts, you see the 1AA afferent axon that's coming from the muscle spindle and the bicep in that picture. The bicep, you have the interfusal fiber, and that axon is where you saw no electrical current. It's sending feedback back to the central nervous system, back to the spinal cord. So you see that red line coming from the muscle spindle. That's your 1AA afferent axon that synapses with the alpha motor neuron in the spinal cord relating to the bicep, which is the green line going back to the bicep. So that's that green star followed by the green line going to the bicep is the alpha motor neuron related to the bicep. So when a muscle contracts and you got proper spindle input, sensory input, you get a reinforcement of contraction through the 1A afferent axon that stimulates the motor neuron going back to the bicep to reinforce the contraction of the bicep. So it's a reinforcing, self-fulfilling mechanism when everything's intact. But if you see the red line also synapses with that black star, which is an inhibitory interneuron, which synapses with the alpha motor neuron of the tricep. See the green line going to the tricep. Well, that inhibitory interneuron that goes to the alpha motor neuron for the tricep says turn off. In order, when under normal circumstances, when a muscle contracts, it sends an inhibitory through reciprocal inhibition. It sends an inhibitory response to the antagonist muscle, and that inhibitory response allows the muscle to move through its full range of motion. When a muscle loses its ability to contract, it loses its ability to, or you lose the input back to the central nervous system, not only to reinforce the contraction of the bicep, so now you have a weaker bicep, but also you lose the inhibition to the antagonist muscle, so the antagonist muscle doesn't relax. So when you have altered communication due to stress, trauma, or overuse, the end result is going to be muscle tightness. You have weakness on the agonist side, i.e. the bicep, a lack of feedback to reinforce the contraction of the bicep, and a lack of inhibition to the tricep. So literally the muscle is weaker and the opposite muscle tightens up. So that led to the whole evolution of MAT. In the most shortened position of a muscle, when that intrafusal fiber is under slack, you have no input to the central nervous system. So the muscle is almost paralyzed. In the lengthened position, you have a neurological advantage, a 90-degree force angle, so a mid-range due to actin and myosin cross-bridging. You have a biomechanical advantage, but you're at a biomechanical and a neurological disadvantage in the most shortened range. The shortened position of one muscle is the lengthened position of another. So if I shorten my bicep, it's the opposite muscle is lengthening. So the shortened position of the bicep is the lengthened position of the tricep. Injuries and pain show up in the extremes of range of motion. You never see somebody sitting there saying, I hurt my back doing this. They say, I bent down to pick up my kid, and that's when I hurt my back. Ooh, when I reach back behind my dashboard, that's when my shoulder hurts. Or, oh, when I turn and swing a golf club, that's when I have back pain. Pain shows up in the extremes of range of motion. Muscle dysfunction shows up in the extremes of range of motion. Muscle tightness is the first sign of muscle dysfunction. Muscle tightness shows up as a protective mechanism to not allow you to move into those extremes. And if you keep putting the body in those extremes of range of motion, the body shouts out in pain saying, quit doing this until you fix the problem. Pain is the result of instability and muscle weakness. So this created a paradigm shift in thought process. The foundation to MAT is muscle tightness is secondary to muscle weakness. And I realize we're going to be cut off here in a second, and these are the principles that lead us to MAT to be able to assess and say, wherever you're tight, wherever I see a limitation in range of motion, it means that one or more of the muscles that move you in that position are tight or are weak. And that's the foundation to MAT. And I rushed it at the end of that as we look at muscle tightness as a sign of weakness, and then we have the tools to be able to assess for weakness. And if you want to find out more information relating to the concepts, please seek us out and find more information on our education program. But this is what led me to the development of MAT. We've had success across the board with athletes and non-athletes at all levels of function. So again, sorry for the rush. Thank you for joining us if you're still on, and try and reach out and grab any more information if you can. Thank you.